No one ever tells you how loud absence can be. Not the kind where someone storms out or slams a door. Not the kind that leaves bruises or broken plates. This absence was quieter than that. It showed up in unanswered messages, in conversations that ended too soon, in apologies that were almost said but never were. She kept waiting for words that never came. Waiting became part of her routine. Waiting while washing dishes. Waiting while folding laundry. Waiting while telling herself she was being patient. Mature, understanding. And the hardest part, no one around her thought she hurting because nothing obvious was missing. No cheating, no screaming, no dramatic ending, just silence. And silence has a way of making you question yourself. Have you ever waited for an apology you felt you deserved? Not because you wanted to reopen the past, but because you needed to know you mattered? Have you ever convinced yourself that patience was love, only to realize later that patience had slowly turned into self-neglect? Tonight's story is about a woman who didn't lose love in a single moment. She lost it gradually, through absence. And it's about the small, almost invisible decision she nearly didn't make. A simple email that quietly changed everything. But before we get there, let me ask you something important. If you believe love should come with respect, if you believe healing doesn't always look dramatic, and if stories about emotional growth, boundaries, and self-worth resonate with you, welcome. You're in the right place. This is Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, where we tell grounded, emotional stories that don't just entertain, but leave you thinking long after the video ends. If you're new here, take a moment to subscribe. And if you've ever waited for something that never arrived, stay with me until the end of this story, because sometimes the most powerful choice isn't being chosen. It's choosing yourself. She almost didn't send the email. It sat there on her screen, drafted and unsent. Just a few polite lines asking whether the volunteer shift on Saturday still needed coverage. Nothing urgent, nothing dramatic. Someone else would probably step in. She hovered over the trackpad, stared at the clock, and considered closing her laptop instead. She was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, but the kind that comes from holding yourself together for too long without being held back. She told herself skipping one Saturday wouldn't matter. No one would notice. And that thought, no one would notice, felt more familiar than she wanted to admit. Still, she sent the email. At the time, it didn't feel brave, didn't feel meaningful. It felt like a way to stay busy, a way to avoid sitting alone with her thoughts on a Friday night. She had no idea that this small, almost forgettable action would become the moment her life began to shift. Not loudly, not all at once, but quietly, through absence, through clarity, and through a choice she would eventually make. Not out of anger, but out of self-respect. She sent the email, then closed her laptop almost immediately. like she didn't want to give herself time to change her mind. For a moment, she just sat there at the kitchen table. The overhead light buzzed faintly. A half-empty mug of tea had gone cold beside her, untouched. Outside, a car passed, tires hissing against wet pavement. Life moving on, indifferent. She told herself it was done now. No reason to think about it anymore. But her chest felt tight in a way she recognized too well. That tightness had followed her for months. It showed up when her phone stayed silent longer than she expected. When she reread old messages, searching for tone, for meaning, for proof she hadn't imagined the connection. It surfaced when friends asked gentle questions she brushed off with easy answers. "I'm fine. I'm good." Really. It just didn't work out. She had gotten very good at saying those things. What she wasn't good at was naming what was missing, because absence doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It slips in quietly and settles where certainty used to live. Her last relationship hadn't ended in a fight. There was no final argument she could point to, no sharp sentence she could replay and say, "That was it. That's where everything broke." Instead, it dissolved. Phone calls grew shorter. Plans became tentative. Affection turned abstract, spoken about instead of shown. When she asked if something was wrong, she was told everything was fine. Just busy, just tired, just thinking. So she waited. She waited because waiting felt responsible. She waited because she believed pressure would only make things worse. She waited because she had been taught, long before love entered the picture, that being patient was the same thing as being good. That lesson went back further than she liked to admit. She had been dependable for as long as she could remember, the kind of child adults praised for not causing trouble, the kind who noticed what needed to be done and did it without being asked. She learned early that attention came from being useful, not from needing too much. When her mother worked late, she adjusted. When her siblings needed help, she stepped in. When emotions ran high, she stayed calm. Silence kept things running smoothly. Silence kept the peace. Over time, she stopped noticing how often she chose quiet over honesty. Not because she didn't have feelings, but because she didn't want to become a burden. That pattern followed her into adulthood. At work, it looked like staying late to finish projects that weren't hers. It looked like saying yes before checking her own capacity. It looked like supervisors thanking her reliability while overlooking her ambition. She told herself she didn't mind. In relationships, it looked like understanding someone else's stress before acknowledging her own hurt. It looked like giving space when she needed reassurance. It looked like believing love was proven through endurance. So when the distance in her relationship began to grow, she responded the only way she knew how. She became quieter. She softened her expectations. She reduced her needs to make room for someone else's uncertainty. She told herself that real love wasn't demanding, that if she stayed steady, things would eventually settle. But absence doesn't settle. It expands. It fills unanswered questions. It turns patience into doubt. It makes you wonder whether you're being kind or simply disappearing. The breakup, when it finally came, felt incomplete. There were no raised voices, no accusations, just a conversation that circled around everything, except the one thing she needed most: understanding. He said he needed space. He said he had things to figure out. He said she hadn't done anything wrong. She nodded. She always nodded. And when it ended, she told herself the apology would come later. Once he had clarity, once emotions cooled, once time had done its work. She didn't realize she was making a quiet bargain with herself. If I wait long enough, the truth will arrive. Weeks passed. Then months. The apology never came. What did come instead was a strange in-between. Not heartbreak sharp enough to demand attention, but a dull ache that lingered in ordinary moments. Folding laundry, driving familiar roads, standing in line at the grocery store, watching couples argue softly over cereal brands. She told herself closure was overrated, but her mind kept returning to the same questions. Was I too accommodating? Did I ask for too little? At what point does patience stop being love and start being self-erasure? These questions didn't have answers. They just circled, unanswered, like the apology she was still waiting for without admitting it. That was why the volunteer work mattered more than she initially realized. The housing nonprofit didn't deal in ambiguity. When a door was broken, it got fixed. When a wall was scuffed, it got repainted. Effort had a visible outcome. Problems responded to action. There was relief in that. On Saturday mornings, she could focus on tasks that didn't require interpretation. No guessing how someone felt. No reading between lines. Just work that met her halfway. The email she sent that Friday night wasn't brave or dramatic. It wasn't a declaration of independence. It was simply a choice to show up somewhere her presence would make sense. And yet, that choice mattered, because it marked the first time in a long while that she acted, not out of waiting, but out of intention. She didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of a shift. Not away from love, but away from the version of love that asked her to disappear quietly while hoping someone else would eventually notice. The Saturday morning arrived without ceremony. No sense of anticipation. No sudden motivation. Just the alarm buzzing beside her bed and the familiar urge to roll over and pretend the day could wait. She stared at the ceiling for a long moment, listening to the hum of the heater kick on, measuring her energy the way she had learned to do with everything else. She could still cancel. No one would be upset. No one was counting on her, specifically. That thought returned again, soft, persuasive, almost comforting. No one would notice. It was the same thought that had followed her through the end of her relationship. The same one that whispered whenever she considered asking for more, speaking up, or admitting that something hurt. So she got out of bed. The drive to the community housing building was quiet. Gray sky, bare trees, streets still damp from the night's rain. She drove on autopilot, her mind drifting in the way it always did when things were too quiet. She thought about the apology she never received. Not the dramatic kind. She wasn't waiting for someone to beg or grovel. What she wanted was simpler than that. Acknowledgement. A clear sentence that said, "I see how I hurt you. I understand what I failed to give." Without it, the ending of her relationship felt unfinished, like a book missing its final chapter. And without an ending, her mind kept trying to write one on its own. Educational truth had started to form in her without words. When closure doesn't come from the outside, the mind keeps searching inward, often blaming itself. She parked, turned off the engine, and sat there longer than necessary. The building looked ordinary. Brick exterior, wide windows, nothing special, and yet walking inside felt different from the rest of her life. Inside, effort mattered. Presence mattered. People noticed when work was done, not because they were watching closely, but because the results were visible. A room looked different when someone showed up. She signed in, pulled on gloves, and picked a task without overthinking it. Wiping down cabinets. Simple, tangible. As she worked, her mind began to settle. The repetitive motion gave her something steady to hold on to. No emotional calculations. No wondering what something meant. She realized how rare that feeling had become. Over the past year, so much of her energy had gone into interpreting silence. When texts were short, she analyzed tone. When calls were missed, she created explanations. When questions went unanswered, she filled in the blanks herself. Waiting required work, emotional work that no one acknowledged. And slowly, subtly, she had begun to disappear from her own life. Not all at once, not dramatically. She stopped suggesting plans. She stopped sharing thoughts that might complicate things. She stopped expecting reciprocity. She told herself she was being understanding. But understanding without boundaries is just another form of self-neglect. That realization didn't land all at once. It came in pieces, small insights that surfaced when her hands were busy and her guard was down. She noticed how good it felt to complete something and see the result immediately. How different it was from waiting on someone else's emotional readiness. How much lighter her chest felt when effort met response. This was the quiet education she had been missing. Not every lesson arrives in a conversation. Some arrive through contrast. At lunch, she sat on the steps outside with other volunteers. Conversations floated around her. Weekend plans, weather complaints, casual laughter. No one asked her to explain herself. No one expected her to perform emotional labor. She was simply there, and for the first time in a long while, That felt like enough. Later that afternoon, as she drove home, she realized something unsettling and freeing at the same time. She hadn't thought about the apology all day. Not because she had resolved it, not because she no longer cared, but because her attention had been elsewhere, on something that responded to her presence, instead of ignoring it. That evening, she cooked dinner without checking her phone. She washed dishes without replaying old conversations. The absence was still there, but it didn't feel as heavy. Educational truth surfaced again, quietly. Healing doesn't begin when answers arrive. Begins when attention shifts. Still, the habit of waiting didn't disappear overnight. Over the next few weeks, she found herself oscillating between two versions of herself. One that felt grounded after volunteering, and another that slipped back into old patterns the moment silence returned. Waiting had shaped her reflexes. When someone took too long to respond, her first instinct was still to assume she was asking for too much. When she felt disappointed, her impulse was to minimize it. But now, there was a growing awareness beneath those instincts, a question she hadn't asked before. What if patience isn't always a virtue? What if it's sometimes fear wearing a polite mask? That question lingered. It didn't accuse. It didn't demand immediate change. It simply existed, challenging the narrative she had lived by for years. She began to understand that waiting had protected her once. It had kept her safe when speaking up felt risky. It had helped her survive environments where needs were inconvenient. But protection has an expiration date. What keeps you safe in one season can keep you small in the next. By the time the next Saturday came around, she didn't hesitate before showing up again. Not because she was chasing purpose or transformation, but because something inside her had recognized the difference between being patient and being present. She wasn't there to be chosen. She wasn't there to be seen. She was there because she chose to be. And that distinction, small, quiet, easily overlooked, was already beginning to change the way she moved through the world. She didn't know yet that this shift would extend beyond the building, that it would eventually affect how she approached love, boundaries, and self-respect. But something had started, not with an apology, not with closure, with presence. If this story already feels familiar, if you've ever waited quietly for something that never came, you're not alone here. Welcome to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. If grounded love stories with real-life lessons matter to you, take a moment to subscribe and stay with us. This story goes deeper than it seems. She learned to be quiet before she learned to be brave. Not because anyone told her to silence herself outright. No one sat her down and explained the rules. They didn't have to. The lessons were woven into everyday life, into the small moments that passed unnoticed, but added up over time. She was the oldest, which meant she learned early how to read a room. She could sense tension before words were spoken. She noticed when her mother's shoulders slumped after a long shift, when money conversations happened behind closed doors, when fatigue settled into the house like a second set of furniture. So she adjusted. She learned to move softly in the mornings. She learned to finish her homework without reminders. She learned that being low maintenance made things easier for everyone. Adults praised her for it. "You're mature for your age. You're such a big help. You never make a fuss." Each compliment carried a quiet message. This is how you're loved. She didn't resent it. She didn't even question it. Being dependable felt good. It gave her a role. It gave her value. And when you're young, value feels a lot like safety. When emotions ran high in the house, she became steadier. When her siblings argued or needed comfort, she stepped in without being asked. She learned how to soothe, how to redirect, how to take responsibility without making it obvious. What she didn't learn was how to ask, not because she didn't have needs, but because needing too much felt like adding weight to an already heavy load. So she learned to carry her feelings quietly, the way she carried groceries in one trip, determined not to drop anything. At school, teachers loved her. She followed instructions. She turned in work early. She didn't disrupt. When she struggled privately. When she succeeded, she accepted praise politely and moved on. Silence, she learned, was efficient, and efficiency became her language. As she grew older, the habit deepened. When friendships shifted or misunderstandings happened, she smoothed them over. When someone forgot her birthday or canceled plans last minute, she shrugged it off. She didn't want to be dramatic. She didn't want to seem needy. There was always a reason to excuse someone else's behavior. They're stressed. They didn't mean it. It's not that serious. Each explanation felt reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a pattern. By the time she reached adulthood, quiet had become her default setting. At work, it looked like competence. She showed up prepared. She anticipated problems before they arose. She took on extra tasks without complaint. Her supervisors trusted her. Her co-workers relied on her. But trust didn't translate into opportunity. Meetings ended without her input being solicited. Decisions were made around her rather than with her. Raises came slower than she expected, if they came at all. When she considered speaking up, a familiar calculation took place. Is this worth disrupting the balance? Is this really a problem? Or am I just being sensitive? Most of the time, she decided to wait. Waiting felt safer than risking friction. Waiting felt responsible. And because nothing immediately fell apart, she told herself the system was working. But there was a cost. She went home most nights feeling drained without knowing why. She carried a quiet resentment she didn't know how to name. She told herself she was lucky to have a job she was good at, a life that looked stable from the outside. Gratitude, she believed, required silence. The same pattern followed her into love. When she met someone who was kind but inconsistent, she focused on the kindness. When attention faded, she assumed circumstances were to blame. When communication became uneven, she adjusted her expectations instead of voicing disappointment. She believed relationships required flexibility. She believed being understanding made her valuable. She believed love meant giving people room to figure things out. What she didn't realize was that she was offering understanding without asking for clarity. And clarity matters. Without it, silence becomes a breeding ground for doubt. She didn't see herself as passive. She saw herself as patient. She saw herself as considerate. She prided herself on not pushing, not demanding, not making things harder than they needed to be. But patience, when it's one-sided, teaches others how little they have to offer in return. That truth hadn't fully surfaced yet. It was still buried beneath years of reinforcement, beneath praise for being easy, beneath the fear of being labeled difficult. She told herself she was strong, and she was, but strength without expression slowly turns inward. By the time absence entered her life, quiet, gradual, unnamed, she was already fluent in endurance. She already knew how to wait. She already knew how to hold space for others while shrinking her own. That's why the silence hurt as much as it did. Not because she didn't know how to survive it, but because she had survived too much of it already. The volunteer work hadn't changed her past. It hadn't erased her conditioning, but it had introduced contrast, a space where effort was visible, where contribution didn't require self-erasure, where presence had a measurable effect. That contrast was beginning to loosen something inside her. For the first time, she was noticing how often she defaulted to quiet, not out of choice, but out of habit. And habits, once seen clearly, can no longer pretend to be virtues. She didn't know what would replace them. Yet, she wasn't suddenly outspoken or fearless, but awareness had arrived. And awareness changes the rules. Silence was no longer invisible. And once you see it, you have to decide what to do with it. Silence didn't feel like a choice to her. It felt like instinct. Even when she noticed it, even when she questioned it, her body still responded the same way it always had. When tension appeared, she softened. When something felt off, she waited. When disappointment crept in, she reasoned it away before it had time to settle. Wasn't weakness, it was training. For years, silence had been rewarded. It kept things moving. It prevented conflict. It made her easy to rely on. And in environments where stability mattered more than expression, that skill had served her well. But skills don't always age with us. What works in one season can quietly limit you in the next. She began to see this most clearly in moments that should have felt neutral, but didn't. Small interactions where she walked away feeling diminished without being able to explain why. Conversations where she nodded along, even as something inside her resisted. She would replay those moments later, alone, wondering when she had stopped participating and started accommodating. Educational truth surfaced slowly. Survival strategies are not the same as life strategies. In her childhood, staying quiet had been a form of emotional intelligence. In adulthood, it had become emotional avoidance. She didn't blame herself for it. Blame had never helped her grow. But she was starting to recognize responsibility, the kind that doesn't punish, but invites change. At work, she noticed how often she filled gaps others left behind. When a meeting lacked direction, she organized. When deadlines slipped, she compensated. When decisions needed follow-through, she volunteered. People appreciated her. They trusted her. But appreciation without advocacy has limits. She watched others, less reliable, less prepared, speak confidently and be heard. She didn't resent them. She just wondered when she had learned that being essential meant staying quiet. She told herself she was being professional. She told herself her time would come. But waiting, she was learning, is only useful when it's paired with intention. Without intention, it becomes inertia. In relationships, the pattern was even clearer. She gave understanding before it was requested. She offered patience before it was earned. She made space for uncertainty without asking for reassurance in return. When communication slowed, she adjusted her expectations. When affection became inconsistent, she explained it away. When she felt lonely in someone else's presence, she questioned her own needs instead of the dynamic. She wasn't afraid of being alone. What she feared, though she hadn't named it yet, was being seen as difficult. That fear shaped her behavior more than she realized. She had grown up believing that love was conditional on ease. That being low maintenance made you worthy of care. That expressing too much could push people away. So she learned to regulate herself before anyone else had to. But self-regulation without self-expression becomes self-erasure. This realization didn't arrive in a dramatic moment. It surfaced in fragments. A sentence she read, a conversation she overheard, a quiet discomfort she could no longer ignore. She began to notice how often she waited for permission to exist fully. Permission to speak. Permission to want more. Permission to be disappointed. And the absence of that permission had shaped her expectations in love. She didn't expect people to meet her where she was. She expected herself to meet them where they felt comfortable. The volunteer work had interrupted that pattern, not by fixing it, but by exposing it. In that space, she didn't need to manage perceptions. She didn't need to shrink or expand herself. She showed up, contributed, and left knowing her effort had mattered. There was no ambiguity in that exchange. And ambiguity, she was realizing, had been the breeding ground for her quiet suffering. Educational truth took clearer shape. Healthy environments don't require you to disappear to belong. That idea unsettled her more than she expected. If that was true, then some of the discomfort she had normalized wasn't inevitable, wasn't the cost of being loving or mature. It was the result of patterns that no longer served her. That didn't mean the people in her past were cruel. It didn't mean she had been wrong to be patient. It meant she had outgrown the version of herself that believed waiting was the highest form of love. Growth often begins this way, not with anger, but with misalignment. She felt it in her body before she could articulate it. A tightening when she swallowed words she wanted to say. A heaviness when she agreed to things that didn't feel right. A subtle fatigue that rest didn't resolve. These weren't signs of failure. They were signals. And for the first time, she wasn't ignoring them. She began practicing something unfamiliar, pausing before responding, not to accommodate, but to check in with herself, to ask whether her silence was intentional or automatic. Sometimes she still chose quiet, but now it was a choice, not a reflex. Other times, she surprised herself by speaking, not dramatically, not defensively, just honestly. Small moments, small risks. Educational truth deepened. Confidence isn't loud. It's clarity. She didn't suddenly become fearless. Fear still showed up, especially when stakes felt high. But fear no longer made decisions for her without her consent. And that shift, subtle as it was, began to change how she saw herself. She wasn't someone who waited because she had nothing to say. She was someone who had learned to wait because it once kept her safe. Safety, however, is not the same as fulfillment. By the end of that season, she could name something she hadn't been able to before. She didn't want an apology just to feel validated. She wanted to stop living in relationships where apologies replaced accountability and silence replaced connection. That understanding didn't close old wounds, but it gave them context. And context, unlike closure, is something you can give yourself. She was still learning, still unlearning, still practicing the balance between patience and presence. But one thing had changed. She was no longer confusing endurance with love. And that realization was preparing her for boundaries she hadn't set yet, for conversations she hadn't had yet, and for a version of love that wouldn't ask her to disappear in order to be chosen. By the time she reached her 30s, being needed had become second nature. Not in an obvious way. She wasn't the loud fixer, or the one who demanded credit. She was the quiet constant, the person others leaned on without thinking twice, the one who remembered deadlines, caught mistakes, and stayed late when something needed to be finished. At work, this looked like competence. She arrived early, prepared. She noticed details others missed. When something went wrong, she didn't panic. She adjusted. When someone dropped the ball, she picked it up without being asked. It felt efficient. It felt responsible. And it felt familiar. Her supervisors trusted her. They used words like reliable and solid. Coworkers thanked her, sometimes sincerely, sometimes casually, as if her effort were part of the background. She told herself that recognition would come later, that her consistency would speak for itself, that patience, once again, was the smart approach. But patience doesn't advocate for you. Meetings came and went. Ideas she contributed quietly resurfaced later in someone else's voice, louder, more confident. Decisions were made without her input, not out of malice, but out of habit. She had made it easy to overlook her. She didn't protest. She adjusted. Educational truth was forming beneath the surface. When you solve problems silently, people stop noticing the effort it takes. She went home tired in a way that didn't make sense on paper. Her life looked stable. Her job was steady. Her responsibilities were manageable. And yet, something felt unbalanced. She told herself she should be grateful. Gratitude, she believed, meant not wanting more. So she swallowed the questions that surfaced late at night. Questions about growth, about ambition, about whether being dependable was quietly costing her opportunities. She didn't want to seem unappreciative. She didn't want to disrupt the image she had built. Capable, calm, low drama. Being needed had given her purpose. Letting go of that role felt risky. At work, she noticed how often people assumed she would handle things. Not because she was assigned, but because she always had. The assumption wasn't cruel. It was efficient, and she had taught them to expect it. Each time she said yes, without pause, she reinforced the pattern. Educational lesson deepened. People learn how to treat you by what you consistently tolerate. She didn't lack boundaries because she didn't know better. She lacked them because she feared what might happen if she stopped being useful. What if she was no longer indispensable? What if her value diminished once she stopped overfunctioning? These questions stayed unspoken, but they guided her behavior. She carried the same mindset into her personal life. Friends leaned on her emotionally. She listened, advised, reassured. She remembered important dates. She showed up when others needed support. When she needed support herself, she hesitated. She didn't want to tip the balance. She didn't want to become a burden. So she rationed her needs. She told herself she could handle things on her own. She had always handled things on her own. That independence looked strong from the outside. Inside, it felt isolating. She didn't realize how much of her identity was tied to being needed until she imagined what life would look like without that role. Without tasks to complete. Without people relying on her steadiness. The thought made her uncomfortable. Educational insight surfaced quietly. Being needed is not the same as being valued. In relationships, this distinction blurred further. She gave emotionally in ways that felt natural to her, checking in, offering understanding, creating space. She became the steady presence others leaned into during uncertainty. At first, this felt like closeness, like intimacy. But over time, she noticed a pattern she couldn't ignore. She was often the one adjusting, the one waiting, the one holding space while her own needs remained unaddressed. She told herself this was what maturity looked like, that love required flexibility, that real connection wasn't transactional. But reciprocity isn't transactional. It's foundational. Without it, imbalance grows. She didn't ask for much, but she noticed how rarely she received even that. Not because people were unkind, but because she had trained them not to expect her to need anything. She didn't blame anyone for it. She was beginning to understand that overfunctioning had shielded her from disappointment, but it had also prevented genuine connection. Educational truth clarified. When you do too much, you leave no room for others to meet you. This realization unsettled her. It challenged the version of herself she had relied on for years. The dependable one, the strong one, the one who didn't need reassurance. But strength, she was learning, doesn't come from carrying everything alone. By the end of that year, the fatigue she felt wasn't physical. It was emotional, a quiet exhaustion from always being the stable one, the understanding one, the reliable one. She didn't want to stop caring. She didn't want to become hard or guarded. She just wanted to stop disappearing inside roles that never asked who she was beyond what she provided. That desire wasn't loud, yet it didn't demand immediate change. But it was there, and for the first time, she was listening. The longer she stayed in the role of the dependable one, the harder it became to imagine stepping out of it. Dependability had become her language of love. It was how she showed care, how she proved commitment, how she stayed connected. When things felt uncertain, she gave more. When someone pulled back, she steadied herself and waited. In romantic relationships, this translated into a familiar rhythm. She was attentive without being demanding. She offered reassurance without expecting it in return. She adapted to changes in plans, changes in mood, changes in communication. She told herself that flexibility was a sign of emotional maturity. And sometimes it was. But flexibility, without limits, slowly turned into self-neglect. She noticed how often she anticipated her partner's needs before her own, how she adjusted her schedule to accommodate theirs, how she softened disappointment before it could even be expressed. She wasn't asked to do this. She volunteered because being needed felt safer than risking rejection. Educational truth surfaced again, quietly but firmly. When love is tied to usefulness, vulnerability feels dangerous. She didn't express this fear out loud. She barely acknowledged it to herself, but it shaped her behavior in ways that became increasingly hard to ignore. When conversations felt unresolved, she let them end anyway. When tension surfaced, she smoothed it over instead of exploring it. When she felt lonely in the relationship, she assumed it was something she needed to work through privately. She didn't want to be seen as difficult. She didn't want to ask for something that might not be given freely. So she waited. Waiting had become her default response to discomfort. It felt productive, even virtuous. It allowed her to believe she was giving things time to improve. But time, she was learning, doesn't fix what isn't addressed. The distance in her last relationship didn't arrive suddenly. It grew through missed opportunities, moments when honesty was available but unused. Each time she chose patience over clarity, the gap widened slightly. At first, she told herself the distance was temporary, a phase, a response to stress. She filled in explanations before they were offered. When communication slowed, she adjusted her expectations. When affection felt inconsistent, she told herself not to overthink it. When she sensed something was wrong, she asked gently and accepted vague reassurance as enough. Educational insight deepened. Silence answers questions even when words don't. She remembered the exact moment she realized something had shifted. Not dramatically, but undeniably. They were sitting together, side by side, both on their phones. No tension, no argument, just quiet. And in that quiet, she felt invisible, not ignored, not unloved, just absent. That feeling unsettled her more than conflict ever had. Conflict, at least, acknowledged presence. Silence erased it. She didn't know how to name that feeling at the time. She only knew that something essential was missing, and that waiting longer wouldn't bring it back. Still, she waited, because waiting had worked before, because she didn't know another way. When the relationship ended, it did so gently, almost politely. There was no explosion, just a conversation that avoided the center of the problem. He said he heeded space. He said he didn't know what he wanted. He said she hadn't done anything wrong. Those words should have comforted her. Instead, they left her suspended. If she hadn't done anything wrong, then why did it hurt this much? If nothing was broken, then why was it over? If there was no blame, then where did the responsibility go? Educational truth emerged through that confusion. Ambiguity prolongs pain because it offers no place to stand. She waited for clarity, for an apology, for acknowledgement, not to reopen the relationship, but to make sense of it. Without that, her mind turned inward. She replayed conversations, analyzed her tone, reconsidered moments where she could have spoken up. She wondered whether her patience had been mistaken for indifference, whether her understanding had been interpreted as permission to withdraw. She wasn't angry. She was unsettled, and unsettled people tend to wait, hoping time will organize what wasn't resolved. But time, she was discovering, doesn't organize truth. It only amplifies what's already there. The volunteer work hadn't erased these realizations, but it had given her a point of contrast, a reminder that effort can meet response, that presence can be acknowledged without being negotiated. That realization made her reflect on how little she had asked for in love, and how much she had been willing to accept in return. Educational lesson crystallized: healthy relationships don't require you to guess where you stand. She didn't yet know how to change her patterns completely. Awareness had arrived before skill, but awareness was enough to disrupt autopilot. She began to see waiting for what it was, not a moral high ground, but a coping mechanism. And coping mechanisms, once outlived, deserve to be retired. By the end of that chapter of her life, she hadn't found closure. She hadn't received an apology. She hadn't rewritten the past, but she had gained something quieter and more durable: perspective. She could see now that being dependable had kept her connected, but not always fulfilled. That patience had protected her, but also limited her. That silence had preserved peace, but at the cost of her voice. Those realizations didn't harden her. They didn't make her cynical. They made her more honest. And honesty, she was learning, is the foundation of every boundary she would eventually set. The relationship didn't end the way people expect relationships to end. There was no final argument that cracked everything open. No slammed doors. No list of grievances laid out across a table like evidence. If anything, it ended the way it had existed for a long time: quietly, carefully, and without clarity. At first, nothing seemed wrong. Texts still came, just not as often. Phone calls still happened, but they felt shorter, more distracted. Plans were still made, but with less certainty. She noticed the changes, but told herself they were temporary. Everyone went through busy seasons. Everyone pulled back sometimes. She had learned not to panic at the first sign of distance. So she adjusted. She didn't bring it up right away. She didn't want to overreact. She didn't want to create tension where there might not be any. Instead, she waited for things to settle on their own. Educational truth was already at work, unseen. When you delay addressing distance, distance learns it doesn't need to explain itself. She filled the silence with understanding. Work stress, family obligations, exhaustion. She told herself that love meant giving someone room to breathe. And maybe it did, but room without reassurance begins to feel like abandonment. When she finally asked, softly, carefully, whether something was off, the answer came easily. "I'm just tired. I've got a lot on my mind. Everything's fine." She accepted those answers because they sounded reasonable, because they didn't accuse her, because they didn't require action. She didn't realize that clarity often feels uncomfortable, precisely because it asks for change. So she stayed patient. She stayed calm. She stayed available. She stopped initiating certain conversations. She stopped sharing things that might feel heavy. She reduced herself to what felt manageable for someone else. Not because she was asked to, because she thought it would help. Weeks passed. Then months. The relationship began to feel like something she was maintaining rather than participating in. She noticed how often she waited for responses, how often she checked her phone, then put it down, then checked again, how she began to brace herself before interactions instead of looking forward to them. Educational insight sharpened. When love becomes effort without exchange, exhaustion follows. She tried to compensate. She was more thoughtful, more flexible, more careful with her words. She told herself that if she just stayed steady long enough, the connection would return. But absence doesn't respond to effort the way presence does. Grows quieter. It stretches. It asks nothing and gives less. There were moments, small but telling, when she sensed the truth she wasn't ready to face. A missed call that wasn't returned. A plan that dissolved without explanation. A look that drifted past her instead of meeting her eyes. Each moment on its own was easy to dismiss. Together, they formed a pattern. And patterns, once seen, are hard to unsee. She began to feel lonely, even when she wasn't alone. That loneliness confused her. How could someone be present in name, but absent in practice? She didn't want to accuse. She didn't want to assume. She wanted understanding to go both ways. So she waited. Waiting had become her way of loving, her way of hoping, her way of not demanding answers she feared might end everything. Educational truth pressed closer. Avoiding truth doesn't prevent endings. It only delays them. The conversation that ended things didn't come after a fight. It came after fatigue. They sat together, not touching, speaking carefully around the edges of what mattered. He said he needed space. He said he wasn't sure what he wanted anymore. He said she hadn't done anything wrong. She listened. She nodded. She absorbed the words the way she always did, quietly, without protest. Part of her wanted to ask harder questions, to ask what had changed, to ask when he had stopped choosing her, to ask why she had felt alone for so long without being told the truth. But the questions stayed inside her. She didn't want to beg for clarity. She didn't want to pressure someone who was already halfway gone. She didn't want to become the difficult ending to an otherwise calm story. So she accepted the explanation that required the least resistance. Space. She told herself it wasn't final. That space could lead to reflection. That reflection could lead to understanding. That understanding could lead to the apology she felt forming somewhere beyond reach. Educational truth settled in later, heavier than before. Hope, when unsupported by action, becomes a form of self-deception. When it ended, it didn't feel like a breakup. It felt like being slowly released from something she had already been holding alone. Friends asked what happened. She gave gentle answers. We just wanted different things. There was no drama. It was mutual. None of those statements were lies. They just weren't the whole truth. The truth was quieter. She had been waiting for him to show up in ways he no longer could or would. She had been patient with absence because she didn't know how to demand presence. And now she was waiting for an apology that might never arrive, not because she needed validation, but because she needed acknowledgement that what she felt was real. Though the distance hadn't been imagined, that the silence hadn't been harmless, that loving quietly hadn't meant loving wrong, but it had meant loving alone. That understanding hadn't come yet, but it was on its way. The days after the breakup didn't look the way she expected. There was no collapse, no dramatic unraveling. She went to work. She answered messages. She kept appointments. On the surface, life remained intact. That almost made it harder. Pain without disruption has a way of going unnoticed, even by the person carrying it. She woke up each morning with the same routine, moved through the same motions, and told herself she was handling it well. People checked in, and she reassured them quickly. I'm okay. It was for the best. We're still on good terms. Those statements were true in the narrowest sense. What she didn't say was that the ending felt unfinished. There were no clear answers to settle into, no apology to mark the damage, no acknowledgement that the distance she'd felt had been real. Without those things, her mind stayed busy, trying to complete a story that had been abandoned halfway through. Educational truth emerged quietly. When endings lack clarity, the mind keeps returning to them, searching for resolution. She replayed moments she had ignored at the time, the delayed responses, the way conversations drifted without landing anywhere, the feeling of being emotionally alone while technically together. She wondered when the shift had begun and whether she had missed the chance to stop it. Self-blame crept in slowly, disguised as reflection. Maybe she should have spoken up sooner. Maybe she should have asked harder questions. Maybe she had been too accommodating, or not accommodating enough. The problem with unanswered endings is that they invite endless interpretation. And interpretation, when turned inward, can become self-punishment. She told herself she wasn't waiting for him to come back, but she was waiting for something. Message, a realization, a sentence that would arrive and say, I see what happened. I see how I failed you. She didn't need reconciliation. She needed recognition. Educational lesson deepened. An apology isn't about reopening the past. It's about validating reality. Without it, she felt suspended between acceptance and doubt. She tried to move forward. She distracted herself. She stayed busy. She volunteered more. She filled her schedule with tasks that responded to effort. Still, certain moments caught her off guard. She'd reach for her phone without thinking. She'd hear a song that took her back. She'd imagine conversations that would never happen. Absence doesn't fade just because you understand it intellectually. It lingers in habits, in reflexes, in the space someone once occupied without fully showing up. At night, the waiting felt louder. She would lie awake replaying the final conversation, searching for what hadn't been said. The silence pressed against her. Not dramatic, not cruel, just unresolved. She realized something unsettling during those nights. She had been trained to wait her whole life, but this was the first time waiting felt like a loss instead of a virtue. Educational truth took clearer form. Patience is powerful, but only when it's paired with mutual effort. Without effort on both sides, patience becomes stagnation. She didn't talk about this with many people, explaining it felt complicated. How do you describe grief for something that never fully arrived? How do you justify pain when there was no obvious harm? So she kept it to herself. That silence, chosen and familiar, felt safer than trying to explain an absence others couldn't see. But something had shifted beneath the surface. The volunteering had given her contrast. It reminded her what it felt like to give effort and receive a result. To show up and know it mattered. That contrast made the waiting harder to ignore. She began to notice how often she was still waiting, not just for an apology, but for permission. Permission to let go. Permission to stop wondering. Permission to accept that some people never explain themselves. She realized that the apology, even if it came, wouldn't undo the loneliness she'd felt while waiting. It wouldn't change the months she'd spent accommodating distance. It wouldn't restore the version of herself who had trusted presence without question. Educational insight sharpened. Some wounds don't need explanations. They need boundaries. This realization didn't bring immediate relief. It brought discomfort, because boundaries require action, and action had never been her first instinct. Waiting had always felt safer, but now waiting felt like standing still in a place she had outgrown. She didn't stop hoping all at once. Hope doesn't disappear on command, but it changed shape. It became quieter, less attached to someone else's behavior. She began to hope for something different. Clarity, self-respect, a way forward that didn't depend on someone else's words. She didn't know yet how she would get there. She only knew that the absence she had tolerated for so long was no longer invisible to her. And once absence is named, it can no longer be mistaken for love. By the end of that season, the apology still hadn't come. What had come instead was awareness. She could see now that waiting had once protected her, but it was no longer protecting her from pain. It was prolonging it. This didn't make her bitter, didn't make her angry. It made her honest. Honest about what she had felt. Honest about what she had accepted. Honest about what she deserved moving forward. The relationship had ended quietly, but its lesson would not. It was teaching her, slowly, persistently, that love without presence is not something you wait for. It's something you walk away from. Waiting didn't stop after the relationship ended. If anything, it became easier. There was no one left to disappoint, no expectations to manage, no emotional temperature to read. Waiting slipped into her days unnoticed, settling into routines that looked healthy on the surface. She woke up on time. She went to work. She handled responsibilities. She answered messages. She volunteered on Saturdays. Life moved forward, but something inside her stayed still. She told herself she was healing. She told herself she was giving things time. She told herself she didn't want to rush the next chapter of her life. All reasonable explanations. But beneath them was a familiar pattern, pausing without direction. Educational truth hovered just out of reach. Rest is restorative. Waiting without intention is draining. She filled her days with motion to avoid stillness. Errands, extra shifts, helping friends move. Staying busy became another form of silence, one that kept difficult questions at a distance. When she was alone, the waiting resurfaced. She waited for clarity to arrive without effort. She waited for the past to lose its grip on her thoughts. She waited for the feeling of being unfinished to fade on its own. Sometimes it did, briefly. Other times, it returned without warning. She noticed how easily she slipped back into hoping for messages that no longer came. How her mind still circled around what could have been said differently. How absence had left a shape she kept tracing, even when she told herself she was ready to move on. Educational insight sharpened. Habits don't disappear when situations change. They change when awareness turns into action. The volunteering continued to offer contrast. On Saturdays, she could see progress. She could measure effort. She could leave knowing something was better because she had shown up. During the week, that clarity was harder to find. At work, she still overextended herself. She still solved problems quietly. She still waited for recognition instead of asking for it. She told herself it wasn't the right time to push, that she needed to stabilize first. That change would come naturally. But natural change requires friction. Without it, patterns remain comfortable, even when they hurt. She began to realize that waiting had become her default response to uncertainty. When she didn't know what to do next, she paused. When she felt comfortable, she stayed still. When she sensed dissatisfaction, she told herself it would pass. Educational truth grew clearer. Waiting can look like wisdom when it's actually avoidance. This realization didn't make her feel empowered. It made her uneasy, because if waiting was something she was choosing, consciously or not, then change was also her responsibility. That idea felt heavy. Responsibility meant risk. It meant stepping into discomfort without guarantees. It meant acting without knowing how things would turn out. Waiting, at least, felt safe. She thought back to earlier versions of herself, how often waiting had protected her from conflict, from disappointment, from asking questions she wasn't ready to hear the answers to. Waiting had once been bail, but usefulness has a shelf life. She began noticing moments when she could act, but didn't. A conversation at work where she could have spoken up, but chose silence. An invitation she declined out of habit rather than preference. A thought she dismissed because it felt inconvenient. Each small non-decision reinforced the same message. Later. Later, she told herself, things would make sense. Later, she would feel ready. Later, clarity would arrive. But later kept moving. Educational truth settled in with quiet insistence. The longer you wait to choose, the more life chooses for you. That realization followed her home one evening after work. She sat on her couch, lights off, city noise drifting in through the window. Her phone lay beside her, silent. She wasn't lonely in the traditional sense. She had people in her life. She had obligations. She had purpose. What she lacked was direction. Not because she didn't know what she wanted, but because she hadn't practiced asking herself that question. Waiting had filled the space where intention should have lived. She realized then that waiting had become a way of postponing accountability to herself. As long as she was waiting, she didn't have to confront what she wanted or what she was willing to change to get it. Educational insight deepened. Avoiding decisions doesn't remove responsibility. It delays it. That night, she didn't come to a solution. Didn't draft a plan. She didn't suddenly feel motivated. What she felt instead was restlessness, a sense that something in her life was misaligned, not broken, but stagnant. And stagnation, she was learning, was its own kind of loss. She went to bed knowing one thing with certainty. Waiting had carried her as far as it could. What came next would require something different. Waiting didn't feel passive to her. It felt active, intentional, almost responsible. She told herself she was being careful, that she was giving herself space to heal properly, that rushing into decisions, new goals, new relationships, new expectations would only create more confusion. From the outside, it looked reasonable, but inside, something had shifted. The longer she waited, the more restless she became. She noticed it in small ways. A tightness in her chest when conversations turned toward the future. An impatience she didn't recognize in herself when plans were vague or open-ended. A growing irritation when people told her, "You'll know when the time is right." She had been waiting her whole life. How would she know if this time was different? Educational truth pressed forward. Clearer now. There's a difference between healing and hiding. Healing moves you toward something. Hiding keeps you bended. She began to recognize how often she used waiting to avoid disappointment. As long as she didn't expect too much, she couldn't be let down. As long as she didn't choose, she couldn't choose wrong. But not choosing had its own cost. Days began to blur together. Weeks passed without milestones. She couldn't point to anything specific that was wrong, only a sense that time was slipping through her hands without asking permission. She wasn't unhappy. She was unfulfilled. And unfulfillment is harder to explain than pain. Educational insight sharpened. Comfort without growth eventually becomes discomfort. She saw this most clearly during one ordinary evening. Nothing dramatic happened. No phone call, no realization. Delivered like a lightning strike. She was washing dishes, standing at the sink, watching soap swirl down the drain. And suddenly, she felt tired in a way she hadn't before. Not emotionally raw, not overwhelmed, just tired of waiting, tired of postponing her own life while telling herself she was being patient, tired of giving time more credit than it deserved, tired of hoping clarity would arrive without requiring courage. That exhaustion wasn't loud. It was steady. Educational truth landed fully. When waiting costs you momentum, it's no longer wisdom. It's fear. She didn't judge herself for it. Fear had been useful once. It had kept her safe, measured, controlled. But safety had quietly turned into stagnation. That night, she admitted something she had avoided for months. She wasn't waiting because she didn't know what she wanted. She was waiting because wanting something meant risking disappointment again. That admission didn't make her feel weak. It made her honest. And honesty, she was learning, was the first step toward change. She began paying attention to what stirred her, what gave her energy instead of draining it. The volunteer work stood out not because it solved her life, but because it reminded her what forward motion felt like. Show up, do the work, see the result. No guessing, no waiting for permission, no interpreting silence. Educational insight deepened. Progress restores agency. She realized that agency, the sense of having influence over her own life, had been slowly slipping away every time she chose waiting over action. Waiting had become a way of outsourcing decisions to time, to circumstances, to other people's readiness. But no one was coming to hand her permission. If her life was going to move, she would have to move it. This understanding didn't arrive with confidence. It arrived with resolve. Resolve isn't loud, doesn't promise ease. It simply says, I can't stay here anymore. She didn't wake up the next morning transformed. She didn't suddenly stop hesitating or doubting herself, but she began making small choices differently. She spoke up once when she normally wouldn't have. She asked a clarifying question instead of assuming. She committed to plans instead of leaving them open-ended. Each choice felt awkward, unnatural, slightly uncomfortable, but also relieving. Educational truth revealed itself through experience. Discomfort is often the cost of reclaiming yourself. Waiting had asked nothing of her. Action asked everything, but gave something back. She began to understand that the apology she had once waited for wasn't the only thing she had been postponing. She had been postponing herself, her voice, her preferences, her right to want more than absence. That realization didn't erase the past. It didn't make the waiting pointless. The waiting had taught her patience, empathy, endurance. But it was no longer enough. By the end of that season, she could name the shift clearly. She was done waiting for clarity to arrive. She would create it instead. And that decision, quiet, deliberate, uncelebrated, marked the end of one chapter of her life and the beginning of another. Not because everything was suddenly clear, but because she was finally willing to move without guarantees. Here at Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, we tell stories that don't just entertain. They help you recognize when it's time to move forward. If that matters to you, you're in the right place. The email wasn't dramatic. That was the part she would remember later. The ordinariness of it. A few lines typed, without flourish. No emotional weight attached to the words themselves. Just a simple question, asking whether help was still needed for the Saturday volunteer shift. She stared at the screen longer than necessary, fingers hovering, the familiar hesitation rising in her chest. This was how waiting usually began. She told herself there was no rush, that someone else would respond, that it didn't matter whether she showed up this weekend or the next. She considered closing the laptop and letting the moment pass. That have been easy, but ease had kept her still for too long. Educational truth pressed gently against her awareness. Small actions often feel insignificant because we underestimate their direction, not their impact. She sent the email. There was no surge of confidence afterward, no sense of accomplishment. If anything, she felt exposed, like she had stepped forward without knowing what she was stepping into. She closed her laptop and stood up, trying to shake the feeling. Her apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet she had grown used to. She moved through the evening on autopilot, making dinner, cleaning up, turning in early. It wasn't until later, lying in bed, that she realized something subtle had changed. She wasn't waiting for anything, not for a response, not for reassurance, not for permission. She had acted. That realization didn't bring peace immediately. It brought restlessness. Action disrupts comfort before it creates clarity. She checked her email the next morning, out of habit, and saw the reply waiting. Yes, we could use the extra help. See you Saturday. Nothing more. No praise. No urgency. No pressure. Just confirmation. And that was enough. Saturday came quietly. She woke early, not out of excitement, but out of intention. The drive felt different this time, not because the destination had changed, but because her mindset had. She wasn't going to fill time. She was choosing where to place herself. The building looked the same as it always had. Familiar brick, familiar entrance, but stepping inside felt different. She noticed it in her body before her thoughts caught up. She signed in, pulled on gloves, looked around for task. No overthinking, no waiting to be directed. She picked something concrete and started. Educational insight surfaced naturally. Momentum builds when you stop asking whether something matters and start doing what aligns. As she worked, her mind stayed present, not absent in the way it used to be, drifting back to unanswered questions, but grounded, focused on what was in front of her. She realized how rarely she allowed herself that state, how often her attention had been split between the moment and the memory of something unresolved. Here, resolution was immediate. You wiped a surface, it became clean. You fixed a hinge, it stopped wobbling. Effort met response. That contrast mattered more than she expected. She didn't talk much at first. She didn't need to. There was comfort in working alongside others, without managing emotions or expectations. No one asked her to explain herself. No one required her to be anything other than present. And presence, she was learning, was a form of self-respect. At some point she paused, leaning against the counter she had just finished cleaning, and felt a quiet satisfaction settle in. Not joy, not excitement, alignment. Educational truth deepened. When your actions match your values, the noise in your mind quiets. She thought about how often she had waited for feelings to change before acting, how she had believed clarity came first and movement followed. But clarity, she was discovering, often arrives after movement, not before it. She hadn't felt ready when she sent the email. She hadn't felt confident. She had simply acted despite uncertainty. That was new. As the morning went on, she noticed how her body felt different, less braced, less guarded. She wasn't anticipating disappointment. She wasn't scanning for absence. She was just there. Later, as she packed up to leave, she realized she hadn't checked her phone once. Not out of discipline, out of disinterest. Nothing was pulling her away from the moment. Educational lessons settled in quietly, but firmly. Presence grows when you stop waiting for someone else to show up and start showing up for yourself. She left the building with tired hands and a lighter chest. The kind of tiredness that comes from effort, not endurance. Driving home, she reflected on how small the decision had been, to send an email, to show up, to act without certainty, and how disproportionate the effect felt. This wasn't transformation. It was orientation. She was facing forward now, instead of backward. The apology she had once waited for didn't feel closer or farther away. It simply felt less central, less necessary to her sense of movement. She wasn't healed, but was in motion, and motion, she was learning, changes what you notice. As she pulled into her driveway, she understood something with quiet clarity. The life she wanted wasn't going to arrive all at once. It was going to be built, decision by decision, by choosing action over waiting. This had been the first brick. She noticed him the second time she came back, not the first. The first Saturday, she had been too focused on the work, too aware of her own decision to show up. But The following week, something shifted. She was more settled, less inward. Her attention had room to expand. He was already there when she arrived, not standing out, not commanding the room, just working, methodical, unhurried, focused on the task in front of him. She noticed how he asked questions instead of assuming, how he checked measurements twice before making changes, how he cleaned up after himself without being prompted. It wasn't impressive in a dramatic sense. It was reassuring. Educational truth surfaced without effort. Trust often begins where consistency replaces performance. They worked near each other for most of the morning, without much conversation. When they did speak, it was practical, clarifying what needed to be done, coordinating tasks, passing tools back and forth. There was ease in that exchange. No posturing, no urgency to be interesting. She realized how rare that felt. So much of her past connection had required interpretation, reading tone, guessing meaning, filling in blanks. This didn't. It simply was. At one point, a cabinet door refused to line up properly. She watched as he paused, assessed, adjusted the hinge instead of forcing it. No frustration, no commentary, just patience paired with action. Educational insight sharpened. Healthy patience looks like engagement, not endurance. When the cabinet finally closed smoothly, he stepped back and nodded once, satisfied. The task was done. She felt something loosen in her chest. Not attraction, not excitement, relief. They exchanged names briefly, without ceremony, and went back to work. No attempt to extend the moment. No unnecessary linger. That restraint felt respectful. Later, during a short break, they sat on opposite ends of the same step, unwrapping sandwiches from brown bags. Conversation came easily. Not because it was deep, but because it wasn't forced. They talked about where they lived, about work, about why they volunteered. He mentioned coming back to town to help family. She mentioned wanting something tangible to put her energy into. Neither of them overshared. Neither of them withheld. Educational truth revealed itself in the space between words. Connection grows when disclosure matches safety. She noticed how he listened, not waiting for his turn to speak, not scanning for something more interesting, just present. Presence had become something she recognized now, not as intensity, but as attention. As the weeks passed, their paths continued to cross, always in context, always grounded in shared responsibility. No ambiguity about why they were there or what they were doing. They didn't flirt. They collaborated. They solved small problems together, adjusted plans, adapted when something didn't work. Each interaction added a thin layer of familiarity, not intimacy, but trust. Educational lesson deepened through repetition. Reliability builds attraction more sustainably than excitement. She noticed how her body responded differently than it had in past connections. No tightness, no vigilance, no anticipation of disappointment. She wasn't waiting for him to become someone. She was observing who he already was. That distinction mattered. At the same time, she remained cautious, not guarded, but aware. Old habits don't disappear just because new patterns appear. She still caught herself pulling back at moments when closeness felt possible, still noticed the reflex to keep expectations low, still felt the urge to wait rather than lean in. But now she recognized those impulses. Educational truth pressed forward. Awareness doesn't erase patterns, but it gives you choice. One afternoon, after a longer shift, they walked out at the same time. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the parking lot. He asked simply if wanted to grab coffee nearby. No pressure, no over-explanation, no assumption, just an invitation. She felt the old instinct rise, the urge to delay, to keep things contained, to avoid changing the dynamic. Waiting whispered again, but this time she noticed it. She noticed how waiting no longer felt protective. It felt restrictive. Educational insight crystallized. Growth often begins at the exact point where old safety stops feeling safe. She said yes. The coffee shop was quiet. The conversation stayed grounded. They talked about work frustrations, family responsibilities, what it meant to show up consistently for things that didn't offer immediate reward. Nothing was exaggerated. Nothing was rushed. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was auditioning for connection or managing someone else's uncertainty. She was just participating. That realization settled into her gently. Love, she was learning, didn't have to begin with intensity or uncertainty. It could begin with mutual effort, with shared values, with showing up where it mattered. As they left, there was no promise made, no future outlined, just an understanding that something had begun. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was steady. Driving home, she thought about how different this felt from waiting for an apology that never came. That waiting had kept her tethered to absence. This felt anchored in presence. Educational truth anchored itself clearly now. You don't heal from absence by waiting. You heal by choosing environments where presence is normal. She wasn't in love. She wasn't certain of anything. But she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Lined and alignment, she was learning, was a far better foundation than hope built on silence. The connection didn't rush forward. That was the first thing she noticed. Days passed between seeing him, sometimes weeks, and nothing collapsed in the space between. No anxiety rose, no urgency pressed in, no unspoken expectation hovered over their interactions. What they were building didn't require constant reassurance. That felt unfamiliar. In the past, distance had meant danger. Silence had meant something was wrong. But this time, quiet didn't carry threat. It carried neutrality. Educational truth surfaced gently. Not all silence signals withdrawal. Some silence simply reflects stability. They continued meeting in ordinary ways. Coffee after volunteering. Occasional dinners that ended early because one of them had an early morning. Conversations that stayed honest without becoming heavy. He didn't overwhelm her with attention. He didn't disappear either. He followed through. When he said he'd call, he did. When plans changed, he explained. When he didn't know something, he said so, instead of filling the space with vague reassurances. Consistency replaced intensity. And consistency, she was learning, created safety faster than charm ever had. Still, safety didn't erase hesitation. It exposed it. She noticed how often she waited for something to go wrong, how her body stayed alert, even when her mind told her she didn't need to be, how she measured his actions, not to judge him, but to protect herself. Educational insight sharpened. When you've lived with absence, presence can feel unfamiliar, even suspicious. She didn't accuse him of this hesitation. She didn't need to. It lived inside her, quiet but persistent. She worried that wanting too much, too soon, would disrupt the balance. That expressing uncertainty might burden something that felt simple. That naming her fear could create the very distance she feared. So she stayed measured, not distant, just careful. But care, she was learning, can quietly become withholding. There were moments when she wanted to lean in, emotionally, not physically, and didn't. Moments when she wanted to share how different this felt, and stopped herself. Waiting, again, hovered nearby. Educational truth nudged forward. Old habits resurface when new territory feels unfamiliar. He noticed the pauses, not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. One evening, after dinner, they sat in his car for a few minutes longer than necessary. The engine idled. The streetlights flickered on. Neither rushed to open the door. He spoke carefully. I get the sense you're holding something back. There was no accusation in his voice, no frustration, just observation. Her first instinct was to minimize, to reassure him, to say everything was fine. She felt the words line up, ready to be released. And she stopped. Educational truth stood clearly in front of her now. Avoiding discomfort protects patterns, not people. She took a breath she hadn't planned. I'm still learning how not to wait, she said quietly. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to fix it. He listened. She told him, without details, without blame, that she had spent a long time being patient with absence. That part of her still expected consistency to fade. That she didn't want to turn that fear into pressure. Speaking, it felt vulnerable, not dramatic, just exposed. Educational insight deepened. Vulnerability doesn't demand reassurance. It invites understanding. When she finished, there was a pause. He didn't rush to respond. Then he said, "I don't want you to feel like you have to earn steadiness from me." The words landed softly but firmly. She felt something in her chest loosen, not because he promised anything, but because he acknowledged something real. That acknowledgement mattered more than reassurance ever had. She realized then how often she had waited for apologies instead of naming hurt. How often she had accepted silence instead of asking for clarity. This was different, not because it guaranteed safety, but because it allowed honesty to exist without consequence. Educational truth clarified itself through experience. Healthy connection doesn't eliminate fear. It makes room for it. They didn't resolve everything that night. They didn't define the relationship or outline the future. They didn't need to. What mattered was that the space between them held truth instead of avoidance. Driving home later, she reflected on how unfamiliar that felt and how right. She hadn't waited for him to notice her hesitation. She hadn't waited for the moment to pass. She had spoken before fear could decide for her. That was new. Not perfect, not effortless, but real. She understood now that trust wasn't built by suppressing fear. It was built by allowing fear to exist without letting it control the outcome. And that realization was quietly changing the way she approached love. Not as something to endure, not as something to manage, but as something to participate in, fully, honestly, and with boundaries intact. Consistency, she learned, doesn't eliminate conflict. It reveals it. As the weeks passed, what they shared deepened, not through grand moments, but through repetition. Showing up, following through, choosing clarity over convenience. The rhythm was steady, almost deceptively so. And within that steadiness, differences surfaced. Not arguments, not deal breakers, values. He believed in naming limits early, in saying no before resentment had a chance to grow. He protected his time carefully, especially where family was concerned. When obligations conflicted, he chose deliberately instead of stretching himself thin. She admired that about him, and it unsettled her. She had built her life around being available, around adjusting, around making things work, no matter the cost. Watching someone hold boundaries so calmly forced her to confront how rarely she had done the same. Educational truth pressed closer. Boundaries feel harsh only when you're used to surviving without them. There were moments when his steadiness rubbed against her instinct to accommodate. A canceled plan explained clearly instead of apologized for excessively. A weekend reserved without justification. A pause before committing to something that would stretch him too far. None of it was unkind, but it challenged her. She noticed a flicker of pride rise in her, an old voice asking why she was always the one who adjusted, why she had learned to bend when others stood firm. That pride tempted her towards silence again. Educational insight sharpened. Pride often disguises itself as self-control when vulnerability feels risky. She didn't want to need reassurance. She didn't want to ask for what felt obvious. She didn't want to reveal that boundaries, something she respected, also triggered her fear of being deprioritized. So she waited, not as long as she used to, but long enough for discomfort to settle. The difference now was that she noticed it. Waiting no longer felt neutral. It felt heavy, like a decision she was making without admitting it. One evening, after plans shifted unexpectedly, she felt the familiar tightening in her chest. The urge to downplay disappointment rose quickly, practiced, and efficient. She almost said nothing. Educational truth stood between impulse and action. Growth happens in the pause between habit and choice. She spoke instead, not dramatically, not accusingly. "I understand why you needed to change plans," she said. "I just want to say that it still disappointed me." The words surprised her with their simplicity. He listened, didn't defend, didn't retreat, didn't rush to soothe. "I'm glad you said that," he replied. "I don't want my boundaries to feel like distance." That sentence mattered. It reframed something inside her. Boundaries weren't rejection. They were information. Educational insight deepened. Boundaries clarify expectations. They don't negate care. She realized how often she had interpreted others' limits as withdrawal, how she had filled in meaning where none was intended, how absence had trained her to expect loss instead of neutrality. This was different. His limits didn't erase connection. They defined it, and her honesty didn't threaten stability. It strengthened it. Still, pride lingered, not ego, but the kind that resists asking for reassurance because it equates needing with weakness, the kind that says, "I can handle this alone." She recognized that voice now. It had protected her once. It had also isolated her. Educational truth pressed gently. Self-respect isn't proven by needing less. It's proven by needing honestly. The more she practiced speaking, the easier it became. Not effortless, but less intimidating. She didn't unload everything at once. She didn't turn every discomfort into a discussion. She chose moments carefully, and each time the outcome reinforced something new. She wasn't being tolerated. She was being met. That meeting didn't erase all fear. Fear doesn't vanish just because it's acknowledged, but it no longer dictated her behavior without question. She began to see how values could differ without colliding, how two people could hold boundaries and still move toward each other, how respect could exist alongside independence. Educational insight crystallized. Compatibility isn't sameness. It's alignment in how differences are handled. He noticed her changes too, not in a dramatic way, just in how conversations flowed more openly, how pauses were filled with honesty instead of assumption, how tension didn't linger because it had somewhere to go. One evening, as they walked side by side after dinner, he said, "Like how you don't disappear when something feels uncomfortable. The comment caught her off guard. She smiled, not because it flattered her, but because it named something true. She hadn't disappeared, not into silence, not into waiting, not into endurance. She was still learning, still adjusting, still catching herself when old instincts surfaced. But she was present. Educational truth settled firmly now. Presence is an active choice, not a personality trait. Driving home that night, she thought about how different this felt from waiting for an apology that never came. That waiting had required silence, self-blame, and endurance. This required courage, honesty, and boundaries. Both took effort. Only one returned it. She understood now that love didn't need to be proven through patience alone. It needed participation, voice, limits, respect on both sides. And while this connection wasn't perfect or guaranteed, it was real in a way absence never had been. She wasn't choosing him at the cost of herself. She was choosing herself and allowing love to exist alongside that choice. And that, she realized, was the difference she had been waiting her whole life to learn. The message arrived on an ordinary evening. No warning, no build-up, just a notification lighting up her phone while she stood at the kitchen counter, rinsing a plate she didn't remember using. She almost ignored it. Not out of strength, out of habit. For months, she had trained herself not to expect anything from the past. She had stopped checking, stopped hoping, stopped leaving emotional doors cracked open, just in case someone decided to return. So when she saw the name, her first instinct was disbelief. No shock, not excitement, recognition. Her body reacted before her thoughts caught up. A subtle tightening in her chest, a pause in her breath. The water still running as she stood there, phone in hand, staring at the screen. Educational truth surfaced immediately. Old wounds respond faster than new beliefs. The message was short, casual, even. He said he'd been thinking about her, said he hoped she was doing well. He regretted how things ended. No specifics, no ownership, no explanation, just enough to reopen something she had worked hard to set down. She turned off the water and sat at the table, phone face down in front of her. The room felt suddenly smaller, quieter. This was the apology she had once waited for, or at least the shape of it. Her mind moved quickly, rehearsing possibilities. What he might say next, what she might finally hear, how this conversation could provide the clarity she had once believed she needed to move on fully. Waiting stirred again, not as habit, but as memory. Educational insight sharpened. The past doesn't return to offer closure. It returns to test boundaries. She picked up the phone again and read the message more carefully. The language was careful, polite, emotionally distant, while sounding reflective. There was regret, but no responsibility. Sadness, but no accountability. She realized something unsettling. If this message had arrived months earlier, she would have responded immediately. Grateful, hopeful, ready to explain herself one more time in exchange for acknowledgement. But now, something felt off. Not wrong. Incomplete. Educational truth pressed forward. Words without accountability feel empty once you've learned to listen for action. She thought about the months she had spent replaying conversations, the nights she had waited for a message like this, the emotional energy she had poured into trying to understand an ending that had never been explained. And she noticed something surprising. The message didn't bring relief. It brought confusion, not because she still cared in the same way, but because the version of her who had needed this apology no longer existed in the same form. She had changed, and growth doesn't make the past irrelevant. It changes how it's interpreted. She didn't respond right away. That alone felt like a quiet victory, not because she was punishing him, but because she was listening to herself. Educational insight deepened. Pause is not avoidance when it's guided by clarity. She sat there for a long time, considering what response, if any, would actually serve her. Not soothe guilt, not reopen wounds, not invite ambiguity. Serve her. She thought about the consistency she had experienced recently, the clarity, the way honesty and boundaries had created safety instead of distance. She thought about how long she had waited for someone to acknowledge what had been missing, and she asked herself a question she had never asked before. If this apology had come sooner, would it have changed anything? The answer arrived without hesitation. No, because the problem hadn't been the lack of words. It had been the lack of presence. Educational truth crystallized fully now. An apology can acknowledge harm, but it cannot replace sustained effort. The message sat unanswered, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she knew exactly what she no longer needed. Still, the decision wasn't simple. Old habits don't release their grip easily. Part of her wanted to respond politely, kindly, the way she always had, to reassure him that there were no hard feelings, to make the moment easy. But ease, she was learning, wasn't always honest, and honesty mattered more now than comfort. She set the phone down again and took a breath. A slow one, the kind that settles rather than prepares. She wasn't angry. She wasn't tempted. She was discerning. And discernment, she was learning, was the reward of all the waiting she no longer practiced. The apology she had once needed had arrived too late, not because of timing, but because she had grown beyond the version of herself who required it to move forward. She didn't know yet what she would do next, but she knew one thing clearly. She would not respond out of habit. She would respond, if at all, from alignment. She didn't answer that night, not because she needed time to craft the perfect response, but because she needed to understand what the response was really for. She moved through the rest of the evening, slowly, finished the dishes, turned off lights, went through motions that felt familiar but carried new weight. The message stayed where it was, unanswered, unread again, no longer glowing. In the past, silence like this would have unsettled her. She would have worried about how it looked, about what it implied, about whether she was being unfair. Now, the silence felt deliberate. Educational truth settled in quietly. Not every message deserves a response. Some deserve discernment. She lay in bed and noticed something surprising. Her thoughts didn't spiral. They moved, yes, but with direction. She considered what responding might reopen. The explanations she would offer, the emotional labor she would inevitably take on if the conversation continued. She asked herself another question, one that would have felt foreign months earlier. What does responding give me that I don't already have? The answer was uncomfortable in its simplicity. Nothing, not clarity, not peace, not closure. Those things had arrived through experience, not words. Educational insight deepened. Closure is not granted, it's claimed. By morning, the decision felt settled, not rigid, not defensive. Settled. She made coffee, sat at the table where she had stared at the message the night before, and opened her phone again. She reread the text once more, not searching for hidden meaning this time, just acknowledging what was there. Regret without responsibility. Reflection without change. She felt no anger toward it, only distance. She thought briefly about writing a response that was kind but firm, something measured, something that showed growth. She imagined the relief of being polite, of leaving the interaction tidy. Then she noticed the impulse beneath that thought. She still wanted to manage the ending. Educational truth surfaced clearly now. Politeness can be another form of self-abandonment when it overrides truth. She wasn't obligated to make this easy for him. She was responsible for making it honest for herself. And honesty, in this case, looked like not engaging. She didn't delete the message immediately. She didn't need to erase it to prove anything. She simply let it be what it was, a reminder of who she had been, not who she was now. Later that day, she shared the moment with someone she trusted, not for advice, not for permission, just to say it out loud. Saying it aloud mattered. It grounded the choice in reality instead of isolation. Educational insight reinforced itself. Boundaries grow stronger when they're named, not hidden. When she spoke about the message, she noticed how calm she sounded. Not detached, just clear. She didn't feel the urge to explain herself excessively. She didn't feel the need to justify the choice. She wasn't proving anything. She was wondering something. That night, she deleted the message. Not a rush, not with a sense of triumph, with finality. Educational truth anchored itself fully. Letting go doesn't require confrontation. it requires clarity. As she set her phone down, she realized something profound. She wasn't choosing silence because she lacked words. She was choosing silence because words were no longer necessary. The apology she had once believed would validate her pain had arrived too late, not because of timing, but because she had already validated herself. She had named what was missing. She had learned what absence felt like. She had chosen presence instead. Nothing was unresolved anymore. The past no longer had a question mark attached to it. She slept deeply that night, not because everything in her life was settled, but because one thing was. She was done waiting for the past to catch up with who she had become. And that choice, quiet, unseen, uncelebrated, marked the moment she truly chose herself. Choosing herself didn't end the uncertainty. It changed how she moved through it. The days after deleting the message felt lighter, not because something had been resolved externally, but because an internal negotiation had ended. She wasn't carrying an unfinished conversation in her pocket anymore. The past had stopped asking for her attention. That didn't mean she rushed forward. Growth hadn't made her impulsive. If anything, it had made her more deliberate. She noticed this in how she approached connection now. She didn't lean in too quickly, but she didn't pull away either. She stayed present, without scanning for signs of disappearance. She listened, without overanalyzing tone. She allowed space, without assuming it meant distance. Educational truth surfaced through experience. Boundaries don't harden you. They stabilize you. The connection she was building continued at its steady pace. Nothing escalated suddenly. No declarations were made. But there was movement. They planned ahead and followed through. They checked in without hovering. They spoke honestly without unloading. Consistency held. She noticed how different this felt from waiting. In the past, she had invested energy into anticipating what might go wrong. Now, she invested energy into observing what was actually happening. That shift freed her attention. Educational insight sharpened. Trust grows when attention stays rooted in reality instead of fear. There were still moments of hesitation. Old instincts don't disappear just because new patterns are healthier. Sometimes she felt the urge to downplay her needs. Sometimes she caught herself preparing for disappointment that hadn't arrived. But now, she paused. She asked herself whether the feeling belonged to the present or to memory. That question became a boundary of its own. She also noticed how she responded differently to conflict. When something felt misaligned, she didn't swallow it immediately. She brought it up, not as an accusation, but as information. She didn't wait for discomfort to accumulate. She didn't assume misunderstanding would resolve itself. Educational truth clarified itself. Healthy relationships address tension early, before it hardens into resentment. He met her there, not perfectly, not always with the exact words she hoped for, but with effort, with curiosity, with accountability. When he misstepped, he acknowledged it. When she expressed a need, he didn't minimize it. When he needed space, he said so without disappearing. That mattered. She realized that love didn't require her to be endlessly patient anymore. It required her to be honest and to expect honesty in return. Educational insight deepened. Mutual effort creates security more reliably than emotional endurance. One evening, after a long day, she noticed something that would have unsettled her before. He needed to reschedule their plans. Not abruptly, not vaguely. He explained why, offered an alternative, and didn't over-apologize. In the past, a change like that would have triggered the familiar spiral. Waiting, wondering, preparing herself for disappointment. This time, it didn't. She felt disappointment because she was human, but it didn't turn into doubt. Didn't attach itself to fear. Educational truth settled gently. Feeling disappointment doesn't mean something is wrong. It means something mattered. She expressed it honestly. He acknowledged it. They adjusted, and life moved on. That exchange, small, unremarkable on the surface, meant more to her than any apology she had waited for in the past, because it showed something crucial. She wasn't alone in holding the relationship anymore. She was sharing it. That realization brought a quiet sense of dignity. No excitement, not infatuation, confidence. She didn't need to be chosen at the cost of herself. She didn't need to endure absence to prove love. She was participating in something built on presence, not hope. Educational truth crystallized fully now. Love becomes sustainable when it no longer requires you to disappear. She wasn't naive about the future. She knew relationships involved risk. She knew consistency today didn't guarantee permanence tomorrow. But she also knew something else. She trusted herself now to notice misalignment, to speak when something felt off, to walk away if presence turned into absence again. That trust changed everything. Choosing love no longer meant losing herself. It meant bringing herself fully into the room and expecting the same in return. And for the first time, that expectation didn't feel demanding. It felt reasonable. What surprised her most wasn't how safe the connection felt. It was how much responsibility it required. Not responsibility for someone else's emotions, that familiar weight she had carried for years, but responsibility for her own honesty, for speaking before resentment could form, for choosing clarity over comfort. This kind of love didn't coast. It asked her to stay awake. She noticed it during ordinary moments. Small decisions that would have gone unnoticed before. When to say yes, when to say no, when to ask a question instead of making an assumption. Educational truth surfaced quietly. Healthy love doesn't remove effort. It redirects it. There were days when old instincts tugged at her, when it felt easier to stay silent to let something pass, to tell herself it wasn't worth bringing up. Those instincts hadn't vanished. They had simply lost their authority. She no longer mistook discomfort for danger. That distinction mattered. One evening, after a long conversation about future plans, nothing dramatic, nothing final, she felt a familiar tightening in her chest. The urge to retreat rose quickly, to slow things down, to wait. She noticed it immediately. Educational insight sharpened. Growth announces itself through resistance before it becomes ease. She named the feeling instead of obeying it. "I need a moment," she said. Not because something's wrong, but because this is new for me. He listened, didn't rush her, didn't fill the silence, didn't interpret pause as rejection. That response mattered more than reassurance ever had. She realized then how often she had confused urgency with connection in the past, how she had mistaken anxiety for intensity, how she had believed love needed to feel precarious to feel real. This didn't. It felt steady, grounded, sometimes even quiet. Educational truth clarified itself. Peace is not boredom, it's security. There were still differences between them, different ways of handling stress, different rhythms, different thresholds for solitude. But those differences didn't feel threatening. They talked about them, not to solve each other, but to understand. That understanding created space instead of distance. Educational insight deepened. Compatibility is built through conversation, not coincidence. She began to see how choosing herself had made room for choosing someone else without compromise. She didn't have to abandon her boundaries to be close. She didn't have to shrink to be included. And because she wasn't shrinking, she didn't feel the need to hold on tightly. Attachment had softened into connection. That shift changed how she imagined the future, not as a guarantee, not as a promise, but as a possibility she could walk toward without losing herself. One afternoon, as they worked side by side again, doing something ordinary, practical, she caught herself smiling for no particular reason. Not because everything was perfect, but because nothing felt uncertain in the way it once had. Educational truth settled gently but firmly. Security grows when effort is mutual and expectations are clear. She thought about the apology she had once waited for. How much power she had given to words that never arrived. How long she had paused her life, hoping someone else would name what had gone wrong. Now, words were backed by action. Presence matched intention, and if something changed, she trusted herself to respond, not wait. That trust was the real transformation. Not finding love, not releasing the past, trusting herself to choose again if needed. She understood now that choosing herself hadn't closed her heart. It had strengthened it. And love, when it arrived in this form, quiet, consistent, honest, didn't ask her to undo that strength. It respected it. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't need to. For the first time, uncertainty didn't feel like absence. It felt like space. And space, she was learning, could hold love without suffocating it. She didn't wake up one morning feeling finished. There was no moment where everything clicked into place and stayed there. No sense of arrival. Life didn't suddenly feel complete or effortless. What she felt instead was steady, the kind of steadiness that comes from knowing where you stand, even when the ground shifts slightly beneath you. Her days still looked ordinary. Work, responsibilities, volunteering, quiet evenings. The world hadn't changed around her. She had. She noticed it in small, telling moments, when plans changed, and she didn't internalize it as rejection, when silence stretched, and she didn't rush to fill it, when uncertainty arose, and she didn't default to waiting. Educational truth surfaced through experience. Growth isn't loud. It's consistent. The relationship continued without drama, not because conflict didn't exist, but because it was addressed before it grew teeth. They talked when something felt off. They respected each other's limits. They allowed space without assigning it, meaning it didn't deserve. Love existed, but it wasn't consuming. It was additive. She realized how different this felt from the past. Love used to require endurance. It used to ask her to stay quiet, to wait, to prove herself through patience. This love asked her to participate. Educational insight, deepened, healthy love expands your life instead of narrowing it. There were still moments when old reflexes knocked quietly, a familiar urge to over-explain, a temptation to soften truth, to keep things smooth. But those moments passed more quickly now, not because she was forcing herself to change, because she no longer believed silence was the price of belonging. She understood something important about the apology she had once waited for. It wasn't just about him acknowledging harm. It was about her wanting permission to stop waiting. And she had given herself that permission. Educational truth clarified itself fully. You don't need validation from the past to live well in the present. One evening, sitting alone after a long day, she reflected on how far she had come, not in terms of outcomes, but in terms of orientation. She no longer lived her life facing backward, scanning for what had been missed. She faced forward now, attentive to what was being built. That shift mattered more than any explanation ever could. She hadn't become less kind. She had become more honest. And honesty, she was learning, was the truest form of self-respect. Chapter 10, Part 2. The resolution didn't arrive as a declaration. It arrived as a series of choices she kept making, choosing to speak when something mattered, choosing to pause instead of disappear, choosing presence over waiting. None of those choices were dramatic on their own. Together, they formed a life that felt intentional instead of reactive. Educational truth settled gently. Dignity is built through repetition, not moments. Love existed alongside her boundaries now, not as a test of them, but as a companion to them. She didn't fear losing herself in connection, because she knew how to find herself again. And if she ever needed to walk away, she trusted herself to do that too. That trust was the quiet triumph. She thought about the woman she had been, the one who waited for an apology that never came, the one who believed patience would eventually be rewarded with clarity. She didn't judge that version of herself. That woman had survived. She had learned. She had carried endurance when it was needed. But she had also outgrown waiting. Educational insight anchored itself firmly. Outgrowing a coping mechanism doesn't erase its value. It honors its purpose. She hadn't closed her heart to avoid pain. She had opened it with boundaries intact. That was the difference. The apology she once wanted no longer held power over her sense of worth. Whether it came or didn't come no longer mattered. What mattered was how she lived now, with honesty, with self-respect, with love that met her where she stood. She still sent small emails she almost didn't send, still showed up to places where effort mattered, still chose consistency over chaos. But she no longer waited for silence to explain itself. She asked, she clarified, she chose, and in choosing herself, she didn't lose love. She found a version of it that could stand beside her without asking her to disappear. That was the ending she had earned. Not perfect, not guaranteed, but real, and for the first time, that was more than enough. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't waiting for someone else to explain themselves. It's deciding that you no longer need the explanation. If this story reminded you that choosing yourself doesn't mean losing love, but finding a healthier version of it, tap the like button so this message reaches someone who might need it too. And if stories about love, boundaries, and real-life growth matter to you, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. We tell stories for people who are done waiting for silence and ready to choose themselves with dignity. Before you go, let me ask you one last thing. What's one small choice you've been avoiding that could quietly change your life? Share it in the comments. You're not alone here.